My name is Nathalie Pettorelli. I work here at the Zoological Society of London, and I'm very happy to welcome you today to this sixth Science and Conservation event for our 2024-2025 program. So how is it going to work this evening? Short introduction by me, followed by three presentations by Paul, Rachel, and Bob. And then we're going to move into a Q&A session where we're going to take questions for around half an hour. So this has been an event that has been 2 years in the making. Should have happened last year, didn't, which is really good because it means that we managed to invite Bob, who just made it from Australia, and so could be here today. Where does it come from? As you know, here at the Zoological Society of London, we work on biodiversity loss and understanding how our world is changing. And indeed, our world is changing and quite fast. Whether you look at climate change, so change in sea level rise, CO2 concentration, temperature, extreme event, whether you look at pollution, air pollution, marine plastic pollution, or whether you're just looking at the loss of nature, things are going very fast and definitely different from what we used to have for quite some centuries. Now, there's a lot of discussion as to where does this come from, and this is not a literature review, this is about anything that you could hear from the pub to a scientific conference, going from inefficient use of resource, improved standard of living, individualism, capitalism, linear economies, diet, fossil fuel dependency, overconsumption, power inequalities. I didn't list all of them, I put some bubble empty, but the point is there's a lot of drivers that are suspected to drive those change, those rapid change. Many of them are working together or have synergies. Many of them are believed to be true while the evidence is not so far. So there's a lot of debate around all of that. But there is some bottom lines. The first bottom line is that most would agree that the current direction of travel is simply undesirable for most of humanity, because environmental degradation is linked to human health effects, impacting how we are from well-being to serious health issue, from economic implication, affecting the food, water, and energy security, having an impact in the long term, or at least there's evidence that we can expect political instability, social instability, impact on inequalities. So this is just not a future most of us want to go towards to. And the other bottom line is that nature is an ally as we weather changes. So coming from someone working at the Zoological Society of London, you would expect me to say that, but let me detail that a little bit more. If you think about climate change, there's now very strong evidence that nature can really help with climate change mitigation, as of helping reducing the temperature as we move toward ending our reliance on fossil fuel. It has also a lot of, provides also a lot of help when you think about climate change adaptation. So if you think about floods, nature can help with the rate of water infiltration. It can create physical obstruction, which will have an impact on the water flows. It can reduce the risk of riverbank collapse. When you think about heat waves, 40 degrees 2 or 3 years ago in London, some people will remember that, I did, and I definitely was happy to see a lot of trees whenever I could. Also reduce the impact of air pollution, then drought, how you get species helping buffer biodiversity via the creation of microhabitat, for example, and then in general, all climatic events, with nature facilitating the mitigation of these effects, notably the one on infectious disease on people. But it's not just about climate change. When you think about nature protection and recovery, it's key when it comes to addressing the current pollution and human health crisis. And ultimately, whatever the discussion here, nature is, we depend on nature for a bunch of things, whether it's food, clean water, our well-being, our spiritual health, whatever you're thinking about, we literally completely depend on nature. And so nature recovery has to sit in the middle of those discussions. But nature recovery is not the only thing. And then in this line where change is inevitable, it's already happening, it will continue to happen, even if we were to change drastically right now. A lot of attention is put to the threat that comes with all those changes, and for good reason. But today, what I really want to talk about is the opportunity to simply build something better, to address some of the issues that were there, even if there wasn't an environmental crisis, to think about how we think about sustainability and how this may have an impact on health, on inequalities, and on all those things that we value together. And so today, I've put together three speakers that I think could be really interesting in terms of thinking about the future, thinking about the opportunity, the plus, the thing that we can have, the thing that we could build, the thing that we could put our energy towards. And the first one is Dr. Paul Behrens, which will think and talk to you about food system transformation, and that what could come with that. The second one is Dr. Rachel Carmenta, and she will talk to you about rethinking environmental governance, about the dependency that we have from one country to another, and how those badly used create more inequalities, more problem, and how we might need to think about that if we want to create a world where most of us would do better. And then we'll finish with Robert Costanza, which has a hope, I'm looking forward to this talk, about the shared vision. How do we build a shared vision for the kind of world we want to have? How do we remove our reliance on this growth for everything, something is very topical in the UK right now, and actually move towards another narrative where we can engage positively towards something that we could create together. With no further ado, I'm going to introduce the first speakers, which is Dr. Paul Behrens, who is currently a British academic global professor at the Oxford Martin School, which is the University of Oxford. Paul's research and writing is on climate, energy, and food, and he has appeared in a scientific journal and media outreach such as the BBC, The Guardian, Nature, Sustainability, and Nature Communication. What's interesting is that he's also an author of a popular science book, The Best of Time, The Worst of Time, Future from the Frontiers of Climate Change, which describes humanity's current trajectory and possible future. Paul, without further ado, please.
Thanks very much, Nathalie. I'll kick us off with an image of the economy. This is from the great ecological economist Herman Daly. And what we can see here is the natural planet and its ecosystems, and the economy is part of that. We take materials and energy, we process them, we use them in different ways, they provide services and goods to humanity, and we create wastes. Now, over time, the economy has grown and grown and grown. So not only has the capacity of the planet and ecosystems to absorb our wastes gone down, but also the size of the economy, the amount of materials going through society has just massively expanded over the last 100 years or so through a great acceleration of material and energy use. And I contend that an economy for a sustainable future is an economy able to cope with post-growth. And that could be a steady state, that could be reducing growth, that can be different ways in which we might see growth in the future, but post this concentration on overwhelming growth at all costs. And I think it's really important to note that what Nathalie just mentioned there, which is change is coming. Change is coming regardless. It is always happening. And I think we're going through an incredibly rapid pace of change at the moment. And I think we will see this post-growth future one way or another. And it will be from nasty to less nasty, as I'll show here. So first of all, a classic one could be inequality and conflict. This is its own feedback loop where more and more inequality produces more and more conflict, which reduces the ability for humanity to actually process these materials and produce this economic growth. Environmental crises, I mean, it speaks for itself. At the moment, we're seeing large-scale impacts on food systems around the world, on all the support systems of society. And the economy, there's no economy on a dead planet, of course. Deglobalization, another trend that we're seeing at the moment where people are friendshoring, bringing production more locally. On the right here is a production facility for some of the most advanced microchips. And this requires the entire intellectual capacity of the world to produce. There are there are 100-odd countries involved in producing the equipment that is necessary to go into this. Massive research teams around the world. Without that capacity around the world, you're going to see reductions in growth. And moving slightly onto the more better side of things here, we're also seeing a demographic decline. So that one way or another, we will be having less consumption. This is a picture for Europe and its projections for population. My opinion is actually we expect even more declines than projected. And finally, the best, and which we'll talk about for the rest of the talk, is sustainable transitions. Because what we'll see is these sustainable transitions can actually lower the throughput of materials and energy through society in quite a substantial way. So I think there's this sort of question of like, how do you actually get to this systems change? Systems change seems so big and difficult to understand. At the moment, we're in this system where we just got to go faster and faster in pursuit of growth. Growth of what? Growth of individual capacity, growth of the economy, growth into nature. What kind of growth? And we have to move somehow into sort of a systemic change in the way in which we're thinking, which we'll hear a bit about later. And New Zealand had its first well-being budget. Whether that made a huge difference or not is open to debate, but it changed the way that people were thinking. But I think what I'm interested in a lot is how do we get from one stage to the other? It's enough to have this idea of some magic future, and a lot of us could sort of imagine what that might look like, but how do you get there? Because if you don't have a reasonable way to get there, then you don't have a reasonable way to act on it, and you don't have a reasonable way to hope for a better future either, I don't think. So talking about the two major transitions which are really important, the first one is a sustainable energy economy. And so here we're really talking about the electrification of transport. We're talking about renewable energy. We're talking about heat pumps. We're talking about batteries. All of this represents a massive reduction in the amount of energy through society. Because each of these different sort of technologies or different behavior changes, if we're talking about transportation, each of these reduces the amount of energy that you need by about 2/4. So it's a large reduction in energy that you need. So it's smaller, it's more distributive, it's more resilient, it's more in the power of the people rather than the power of central generators. So these are all really big, important things that actually might push towards a sustainable future in a pathway towards that. One thing I really want to note here is that people say, well, what about the materials for this energy transition? We need so many materials, and surely this is going to break the bank. This is going to break nature. Well, in our work, what we've looked at is the amount of mining that's required for the energy transition over time. And you can see here the coal in the red, and you can see the renewable energy technologies in the different colors there. And what we find is that the energy transition is lower in terms of the amount of mining activity than we need, than the amount we mine for coal today. So it's a significant drop in the amount of materials that we need. And here we modeled a scenario where there's loads of material use. It's not necessarily a future I want to see, but there's loads and loads of material use. And we could actually reduce that even more with recycling technologies. So if we substantially improve these recycling technologies, we could reduce by about 50% the amount of materials that we're actually extracting for the energy transition today. And we could keep those materials in society and reuse them and continue to reuse them rather than having to extract new virgin materials. Of course, a scenario that I would like to see is even fewer materials, and this is the kind of future that I would particularly like to see. Moving on to food systems, if we don't address food systems, we just cannot be sustainable. Food systems on their own are enough to push us beyond all of the climate limits that we're talking about. And food systems are the second largest driver of climate change, the first biggest driver of biodiversity loss, the first biggest driver of land system change, the first biggest driver of freshwater, of nutrients that can kill water life, of ocean acidification. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. So if we look across the whole spectrum of different environmental impacts, food systems are the biggest single driver. On top of that, biggest driver of zoonotic diseases, biggest driver of antimicrobial resistance. And all of this is mostly driven by animal agriculture. And this is another example, again, of how our economy, and this is our food economy in this case, takes up a huge amount of space, a huge amount of resources on the planet. So a sustainable food economy, I think this is another case where change is going to happen. Food prices are going to go up. We're seeing more and more impacts of climate change on food systems. And we just have to take a step back and just go, well, what's breaking the bank? Well, 80 to 99% of calories and protein in the plant fed to animals is wasted. About 85 to 95% less land would be needed for plants in the equivalent protein transition, and we need that land to help nature help us to roll with the punches of climate change. This is some work that we did to look at a dietary transition in the UK. And on the left-hand side, you can see the average diet that we're eating at the moment, all the way across to diets with less and less animal source foods in them. And you can see the amount of land that's embodied in the UK to produce that diet. Now, if we go to the sort of middle of the road one, where we still have some animal source foods, we save an area roughly the size of Scotland. If we move even further towards a completely plant-based diet, no animal foods, we're talking in an area larger than Wales. And you can imagine what that might mean for the resilience. You know, this plant-based shift means a smaller, healthier, more resilient agricultural system. And the reason why I'm talking about this, more than talking about waste, more than talking about production and all these other things, is plant-based diets have the biggest single opportunity that we have, and we cannot ignore them, even though it's the thing that we're told can't change. It's the one that has to change. And so when we look at the food system transition, it is analogous to the energy transition in many ways, because you're talking about 65% lower labor inputs. And then we can pay farmers, we can pay producers to produce common goods for us, to protect biodiversity, to help with carbon sequestration, to manage the land in sustainable ways. We can have much lower land inputs, as I just talked about, much lower subsidies, so we can put those subsidies to better use, and lower assets that we need. This is all work that we're doing at the moment. But we have to address this other question of imports and exports, because if we improve the situation here, and we just export our damage overseas, as we're currently doing all the time, then it's for no good, right? So if you think about the things that this allows us to do, it allows us to absorb the climate yield losses. By saving all this land, we could have some land in production, in reserve, so that we can cope with these climate impacts. We can have greater food diversity. If anything, this would provide farmers way more opportunities for engaging in the practices that we know a lot of farmers really want to engage in, which is more environmentally friendly practices, which may have lower yields. This is lots of green space. I mean, the UK has one of the worst mental health outcomes in the high-income countries. And we know that green space is important for people. We know it's important for people's health. So again, think about the amount of land that we would save and the amount of green space we could provide. Recreation, of course, and of course, wilderness spaces and biodiversity. The UK, as I'm sure many people in the room know, is one of the most nature-deprived countries in the world. So if we think these food systems and these energy systems have to change, and that they're going to be so much better for sustainable economies, how do we value what's good in the economy? This is a picture of all the different non-GDP metrics that have come out to try and measure beyond GDP over time. So there's been this increasing interest in what this looks like. And when you try and actually arrange this in a sort of figure of all these different indicators, you can see how just overwhelming they are. And so we can see here we've got the genuine progress indicator, we've got planetary boundaries, you've got the development index. You can see right in the middle there you've got sustainable development goals. So what we really need to do is narrow these down a little bit into a package of indicators, a package of metrics, which we can start to measure, start to focus on as a community. We put together a database which brings these metrics and indicators together, and if you want to have a look at the database and go online and play around with it, there's the QR code there. And this really goes into all of these different metrics over time for as long as these metrics have been available. And you can start to have a look at how these things have changed and how different countries, even with higher GDP, have poorer outcomes. And the reverse is also true. So if you look at the US, for example, many, many poor outcomes, but a higher GDP. So I just want to leave this talk with a few small questions, and maybe we can talk about these in the discussion in a minute. I think there's some really big questions about how we go beyond GDP in the long term. So we've got these energy and food system transitions, but then what does that mean for the different things that rely on growth so strongly? So, for example, how do you provide pensions in a world of steady state or beyond GDP? What happens to public debt ratings which for countries that move beyond GDP. The first country that says we want to move beyond GDP, they may see their debt ratings and the confidence in their debt going down because markets don't believe that they can actually repay those debts. So how do we get around that is a common action problem. How do we stop offshoring impacts without further geopolitical upheaval? And here I'm thinking things like tariffs and things like border adjustment mechanisms, where we put prices on the goods coming in to the country so that we're not just offshoring our impacts to other countries. How do you best confront power? I think this is a really big question because there's a really big vested interest in energy, in food, in economics across the world in continuing this system that is hurting us so much. And if you think about the changes coming one way or another, we have to somehow address this issue of these people not wanting to change. And I think that's a big question. And finally, what's the policy sequencing for these decentralized, resilient, sustainable economies? I said, we've got this image of the future, of which I think probably a lot of us in the room have a sort of similar idea of what that might even look like. But how do you actually get there when the system is so complicated and you've only got so many levers? And one thing I want to sort of leave us with is, this is a sort of intentionally overwhelming plot, but this is from some work that looked at how did countries get to a carbon price. There was a time when people thought, a carbon price, that's kind of impossible. We're never actually going to get to be able to put a price on carbon. Well, it happened through loads and loads and loads of smaller policies that built up over time and reduced the thresholds and the barriers to actually get these carbon prices done. So you can have a look at that paper, you can have a think about what that would mean in the case of sustainable economies, and perhaps you can talk a little bit about some of those questions later. Thank you very much.
So if you have questions, keep it close to you because we will have a Q&A session at the end of those 3 presentations. And so I think this is a great presentation to then move to Rachel's presentation entitled Connected Conservation, Rethinking Conservation in a Hyper-Connected World. So Rachel is an environmental social scientist specializing in research at the intersection of environment and development, environmental risk, and the relationship between place and well-being. She's particularly interested in the design, performance, and social equity of environmental governance. Rachel, your turn.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for coming here tonight and for the invitation also to speak. I wanted to share this work, which is some thinking on how we might reposition or reorientate conservation action to meet some of the realities of our hyperconnected world. And before I begin, I just want to take you to the north of Brazil, to the Amazon, where I do a lot of my work over the past couple of decades, working in small communities throughout the Amazon rainforest. These are communities of Ribeirinho or river-dwelling populations. They're the most numerous population throughout the Amazon. You can see here through the images that they draw heavily on indigenous modes of existence, although they don't define themselves as indigenous. Yet they use the forest heavily in their life ways. So they collect their materials from the forest. You can see here the home of Dona Chica. They collect their food from the forest. You can see the game that's been caught here, and that game will then be shared with other households in the community through gift and moral economies of exchange and reciprocity. Fish comes from the rivers. People derive a lot of their protein from the river. And also medicines. So in that way then, the forests really are pharmacy, but they're also larder and they're also library. And really crucially, the forests are also part of people's identity and their territory. So the forests and the people-nature relationships within them are a huge source of what we call relational values. And that is to say that the people-people relationships that exist in these communities are possible because they are embedded in that landscape, in nature. And so the people-people relationships are themselves contingent on the forest and its existence. And you can see there in the top left, that's the community having mobilized to go to a funeral of of a community member. Everyone arrived through the night and provided all of the foods and worked and sang, and then went off in the morning to go and to mourn and to sing for the death of their community member. So the relational values in these places are really strong, as are the governance and institutions which people have developed over generations to manage these territories, and the knowledges which are also plural, and different ways of knowing and living and being in the world are strong in these types of landscapes. And we know too then that these are the very places on the planet which are delivering conservation. These are not only biodiverse landscapes, but they're also culturally diverse. And there we get the term biocultural diversity. And so some brilliant work by Stephen Garnett and his co-authors have showed and sort of quantified the extent to which the land held and managed by Indigenous peoples and local communities also overlap with those parts of the planet which are the low-intensity anthropes and where biodiversity is doing well. So these places are delivering conservation in biocultural ways, and are also the sites where conservation tends to emphasise its actions. So site-level conservation is a huge part of the conservation toolkit for obvious reasons, because biodiversity is high in those landscapes. And over recent decades, conservation has moved towards more win-win and even triple wins now. So when I say win-win, I mean conservation and development, or conservation and poverty alleviation. And now also, of course, climate mitigation is part of that sort of triple win idea. And within the conservation strategies that we see, there's really a tendency then in these site-level interventions to focus on protected areas. And one design of that model is the fences and fine approach, where people may even be sort of removed from their territories, or at least parts of landscapes are protected through fences and fines, keeping people out. Within the protected area sort of bag, there are also sustainable use reserves, but that's only 25% or so of the protected areas. Sustainable use reserves are more the model where people are allowed to live and to be inside these landscapes, interacting with nature, but still with different rules around their resource access and rights. Payments is another approach in terms of payments for ecosystem services. So the idea to reward or to pay people for the perceived sort of change in their behaviours and the price that they will pay for practicing conservation, or introducing alternative livelihoods into these landscapes, into the types of communities which we went to in that first slide. And so I think brilliantly coined in this paper by Skutch and Turnhout is this sort of observation that, hang on, if communities are the solution, then what's the problem? And we know, and I think the first talk in Nathalie's sort of overview in the beginning as well, really we know that it's wealth and consumption that are in fact the greatest drivers of biodiversity decline. And not only biodiversity decline, but also convergence culturally, cultural convergence, so the loss of that biocultural diversity. And there's been plenty of work to quantify that. And you can see different figures along the bottom, from economists to the conservation scientists and ecologists, who are all really declaring and recognising the disproportionate role of wealth and consumption on the natural planet. And here on the right, you see, and I think perhaps even Nathalie had this picture as well, but some of the direct drivers of biodiversity decline across the systems of terrestrial, freshwater and marine can all be mapped back to wealth, climate change, pollution, land and sea use change. So we know that this is really a crucial issue. And these are different papers, there's plenty more, they're in very influential journals, difficult to publish in. The evidence is sound. So given that backdrop then, I just wanted to flag some of the issues which perhaps present themselves when we consider that the conservation toolkit conventionally really does emphasise this site-level focus in biocultural landscapes. And in so doing then, does run into different problems, such as exonerating those most responsible, those driving biodiversity decline and centres of wealth through our consumption. But it also misses the opportunity of learning from those plural values, those governance systems, those ways of living and being in the world that still exist in the places which might be peripheral to the market and perhaps suffering in terms of cash poverty. But if we expand how we consider poverty to really think about well-being, then the absence of cash doesn't necessarily mean the absence of well-being. Of course, there's an issue around basic services, which I'm not saying are not important. But the other issue of the site level emphasis is that it's not delivering. We can see through all of the evidence that conservation, isn't delivering, and biodiversity is collapsing, and environmental health is in decline across many of the different ways in which nature contributes to people and well-being. We see declines. And at worst, this site level emphasis can generate harms through evictions of local communities from their territories, through severed people-nature relationships and all of the knowledge and the values that comes with that. And here on the left you see, I think, a very powerful picture drawn by a Filipino artist, which sort of shows the idea of accumulation by dispossession, and sometimes under the narrative of intensification and sparing land for nature, which can be another way of legitimizing pushing people out of their territories and out of their landscapes. And there's really a sort of colonial backdrop too, because there is the idea that poverty or cash poverty is the issue, and so therefore resolving poverty through bringing money into these places or through excluding the poor from different landscapes can deliver conservation. And yet we know that places are hyper-connected. So on the bottom right there you can see, for instance, the community centre, which is now surrounded by a sea of soy, as communities have been pushed out and soy has come into the landscape, and of course then connects to distant markets and the demand from distant consumers. So we submitted those ideas in a critique, essentially, to a journal, and what we got back was, well, it's all very well having a critique, but if that's the critique, then what should conservation do instead? And that was a much harder question to answer. And I think partly perhaps because of COVID, we had it felt like things had slowed down, and we did have time to really give this a lot of thought. And we connected, I pulled together people from different disciplines with different backgrounds, different sets of knowledges, to try to weave our critique into something more constructive on what conservation might do instead. And of course, when you're asking the question, what could conservation do instead, you actually have to answer this other question, which is, where are we aiming for with this? If there's a different future that we want conservation to contribute to, what is that different future? And so we came up with 4 desired states. And you can see on the left there with the purple background, these are the desired states and centres of wealth. So gratification over growth and accountable trade. And on the right, then in the biocultural centres, conservation working towards the autonomy and rights of local communities and indigenous groups, and really recognising the knowledge and the value diversity which exists in those places. And this is the sort of the schema or the diagram of how the model of conservation that we're proposing comes together. We called it connected conservation because of this dual-armed approach. So on the left, there is the actions in centres of wealth. And that's really where conservation is sort of more unique, if you like. These tools that we're suggesting here, I would say, challenge more the norms of what conservation tends to do. And these are actions across different levers. So the levers are there in the circles: governance, the economy, individual and collective action, and then science and technology. Those are different spaces where conservation could be employing actions to try to disrupt and diminish these 3 dominant flows that undermine biodiversity and that come from centres of wealth. And so those are international trade, climate change, and the One World development model, which we've heard about already in Paul's talk. The idea that growth is really the quest of development. And then on the right, this is more what conservation does already, but with some adaptations, I would say. It's about enhancing and amplifying those marginalised flows that come from biocultural centres and deliver conservation, but yet they're attenuated. And those are local governance, diverse knowledge, and plural values. So conservation working to ramp up the contribution, and in the best case scenario, actually taking learning from biocultural centres to help sort of realign the values that we hold in centres of wealth. And what this means really is that it challenges conservation to have collaborations with sort of unusual partners across sectors and across scales in new ways of working. And these are some of the examples. There's a paper which you can look at if this is interesting to you, and you can see more about the details. But essentially, in the centres of wealth, working towards gratification over growth and the breaking of capitalist habits, that can be achieved through things such as education and advertising to mainstream concepts which are sort of peripheral in our vision, and actually we think of as sort of alternatives which are maybe inaccessible to us. Pricing and services so that we ourselves can actually make those better decisions rather than feel like they're unattainable to us. All of that, of course, has to come, as Paul was saying, there's power structures involved, so there's a role for civil society to motivate and demand these changes from decision makers and policy makers. And then in terms of science and technology, collaboration, across various different disciplines, including environmental law, for instance, and understanding how to raise the profile of those alternatives, different ways of life and models of well-being. Then in biocultural centres, these are different examples, again, across these sort of various levers that we've identified to champion and empower the autonomy of local communities and their different ways or visions of sort of well-being through, for instance, place-based and Indigenous curricula. They can be very powerful for really sort of ramping up and reconnecting people to their sense of pride and to staying within their territories. Pricing that reduces the pressures on Indigenous lands, supporting Indigenous peoples and local communities with their principles of sovereignty and solidarity, for instance. And maybe more research and understanding how to enable and support the persistence and resistance of communities rather than the focus which tends to be on documenting drivers of decline. So, of course, this also means that the actions for conservation in this hyper-connected world need to be situated along threat chains. This is an idea from Nielsen and Bamford and others, that drivers exist in one place, but then we see biodiversity impacts in another. So can we design conservation to operate in different points along this threat chain, engaging those levers? And ideally in concert. Actions operating in concert to tackle one particular biodiversity or environmental challenge. And that's really no small feat for conservation, of course, but it seems to be essential really to think about reorientating conservation action to better deliver. And I liked the last slide of, the complexity. Just because it's complex doesn't mean it's unattainable. So this is a summary of some of the key points then for the connected conservation model, really inspired by this urgent need to mobilise change if we want to secure sustainable futures, to disrupt and diminish those flows from centres of wealth whilst enhancing and amplifying the contribution of biocultural centres. And then that will require really interdisciplinary, cross-scale and connected endeavours, unconstrained by ideas of simplistic notions of poverty as the absence of cash, and trying to sort of resolve that through bringing cash or excluding poverty from landscapes when we know that actually these are biocultural centres. And just to finish then with a slide on some of the ways in which the local communities and these ways of life can contribute to different futures or to different ideas of living well. We know, for instance, the local governance which exists in these places is a counterforce to one world development, and it is delivering conservation. So, practicing rather than individualism and accumulation, instead it's about community and commons. Place attachments and relational values, the gift and solidarity economies. There's so much learning from these communities that can really help to inform us in a quest for more sustainable futures with well-being and justice at the centre. So that's it. Thank you.
So we're going to end these three talks with Bob Costanza. We will talk about Addicted to Growth, a societal therapy for a sustainable well-being future. So Bob is a professor of ecological economics, now here at the Institute for Global Prosperity at UCL. And he's also a 2024 winner of the Blue Planet Prize. He's an ambassador of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, co-founder and past president of the International Society for Ecological Economics and founding editor of Ecological Economics. Bob.
There we go. Thank you very much. And thank you for those two previous talks. I think you set the stage for what I want to talk about quite nicely. And that is the fact that we've known about these problems for a long time. Excuse me. And we've known, I think, about the solutions for a long time. So the question is, why haven't we acted more quickly? What's been holding us up? And I think one way of thinking about that is that we're addicted to the current system. We're locked in. There are all these positive feedbacks and short-term rewards that force us to ignore the long-term consequences. We know that we're in a whole new geologic era, the Anthropocene, because of the magnitude of human influence on the system. We live in a full world, as Herman Daly has called it, and has pointed out before. So I think that means that business as usual is really no longer an option. We have to create, if we want to create a sustainable and desirable Anthropocene, we need to think and act quite differently. And it is an opportunity to build a new economy and society that's based on a different goal, this goal of sustainable well-being of humans and the rest of nature, and recognizing that interdependence. We're not separate from nature. It's humans, and we're part of this natural system that we have to recognize that interdependence with, rather than the single-minded pursuit of GDP growth that's been dominating our policies over the last several decades. So to achieve sustainable well-being, I think we have to have these three elements: to have an adequate vision, first of all, of how the world is, our scientific understanding of the world. And certainly there's been a lot of progress in that regard, in understanding how the Earth system functions, what our planetary boundaries are. But also, there's been a lot of progress in understanding what does contribute to human well-being. The whole field of positive psychology, for example, has shown that we're not driven by consumption only. We are quite cooperative creatures. We need community. We need this interaction with nature in order to achieve well-being. We also need a shared vision of how we would like the world to be. And I think to make progress, that vision has to be truly shared. And I think that's part of the issue that I'll talk about. And I think part of the therapy going forward is how to create that shared vision. We also need the tools and analytical techniques to help us get there. And that's, I think, going to be thinking more in whole systems terms and being able to understand the complexities of these systems. And finally, we need implementation strategies that can help us get there. And I think that's going to involve some new kinds of institutions, based on the work of Elinor Ostrom, for example. How do we build institutions that actually can manage our common assets in a sustainable way and lead to well-being? And I think it's also going to take some societal therapy to overcome this addiction to GDP growth. We've mentioned some of this. I think we need to recognize from a scientific point of view that the world is a complex, nonlinear, adaptive system. There are thresholds, there are tipping points, there are surprises. These are some of the potential climate tipping points that are out there, including the ice sheets melting, but there are several other tipping points that could really change the climate quite dramatically. I've already seen this chart about the planetary boundaries, and this is the latest version of several of these articles that have come out. I'm sure you've seen something about this, recognizing that we're already past 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries in terms of being outside the safe operating space for where we are. And we know we're on a threshold. We could go over the cliff into this hothouse Earth that would be very difficult for us to recover from. So we need to make this transition to this through Earth stewardship to a more stabilized planet. Okay, so we've known all of these things, but unfortunately, that's not the movie that a lot of people are still lining up to go see. It's too easy to believe that these are not really problems; they're inconvenient truths. So how do we solve that? And I think we need, first of all, to create a new movie, a third movie. We need a movie that's a better vision and a better narrative of a positive future, the sustainable and desirable economy in society, in the rest of nature. We need to stay within planetary boundaries, but we also need to create the elements of well-being and quality of life. You know, it's sort of the donut picture that was also shown before that Kate Rayworth has come up with. And this has been the goal, I think, of ecological economics from the beginning. How do we create an economy that has an ecologically sustainable scale? How do we stay within planetary boundaries with our economic activities? How do we have a socially fair distribution of wealth and resources, both within the current generation of humans, but also between current and future generations, and between humans and the other species that we share the planet with? So this whole issue of fairness and distribution, I think, is a key one that certainly has been getting more attention lately. And finally, an economically efficient allocation of resources, but we need to include in that allocation mechanism not just the market allocation system, but the system for allocating all of the other things that are not marketed, all of our ecosystems, services, our natural capital, our social capital. So we need to do all of those things, I think, to get to sustainability. And this is not the only version of these ideas, I guess. I think there are a lot of overlapping ideas, and I just list a few of them here: the well-being economy, the circular bioeconomy, the regenerative economy. The Chinese are talking about ecological civilization, the donut economy, steady-state economy, et cetera. And I think there are more versions of this. So we need to recognize that there is a consensus building along these lines. We need to recognize that in order to achieve the sustainable well-being, we need to manage all of our assets, our built, our human, our social, and our natural capital, and how they interact in complex ways in different places and times to produce this sustainable well-being. So I won't focus on that today, but I'll focus on how do we overcome this addiction that we're in? How do we break this addiction to the growth at all costs economic paradigm, to fossil fuels, to overconsumption in high-income countries at least, and to this growing inequality. And I'll argue that a key step and a missing element in that therapy is to create this shared vision of what this sustainable and desirable future could look like. So to get at that, we've done some research working with psychologists and ask the question, well, can we learn something from what works at the individual scale to overcome addictions that we can apply at the societal scale? And it turns out that there's a therapy called motivational interviewing. Has anybody ever heard of this? No, because we're not psychologists. And I think a key feature going forward is how do we build these bridges across disciplines? How do we bring in different ideas that can help us to solve some of these complex problems? But anyway, I didn't know about this until we started working with some psychologist colleagues. But it seems to be one of the most effective therapies for treatment of substance abuse. And instead of confronting addicts with the problem, it engages them in a positive discussion first of their goals, their motives, the kind of future, the kind of life that they want. And it's not until you can establish that that you can motivate really the difficult changes that are necessary to overcome the addiction. Right? So what's the obvious analogy at the societal scale? Well, how do we build that shared vision of what we all as a society really want? And that's what's, I think, the missing element. There is the UN Sustainable Development Goals. I think that's a massive step in the right direction about building this shared vision. But I think it's still something that's too focused within the policy community. I don't think the general public really has any real knowledge of the SDGs or commitment to them. And I think that's the missing part. How do we expand that understanding? How do we get the public to understand that there is a better future? There are alternatives. It's not the only way. We can't. And so one way of thinking about that is to think about scenario planning. What are the possible futures that could be out there? And what kind of uncertainties or characteristics are they based on? Our conventional market forces scenario is based on continuing focus on GDP growth, continuing focus on individualism, and we can see where that's leading us. We could do a more policy reform kind of scenario. These are sort of archetypical scenarios that the Great Transition Initiative has been working on for decades now. The policy reform scenario, we need more government planning and we need to worry about inequality, but still it's growth, growth, growth. So I think the major political parties in most countries are one or the other of those top two scenarios. But what we really need to do is focus really on well-being and at the community scale. And I think that's what the Great Transition Initiative is about. But how do you put these choices out to the public? I think that's where the SDGs come in as well. I think to engage the public, we need to frame these issues in a much more engaging way. We need to use visuals. We need to use movies. We need to use games. We need to do things that really could engage the general public. We're actually talking about having a video contest to have people submit short videos that show life in all four of these alternative futures, and use that as a way to engage people in thinking about what the possibilities are. When you look at it this way, okay, I think it's a little easier to say, at least we don't want to be in fortress world, although that seems to be where we're headed in a lot of countries. And so how do we avoid that? And how do we actually get to the kind of world that we want? And how do we make it clear that that is the world that most people really want? One way is we've done some public opinion surveys along these lines. In Australia, we changed the names of these scenarios a little bit, just to avoid what some people thought was being a little too value-laden in the names that we chose. So we're talking about community well-being instead of the Great Transition, et cetera. And then we had people read, short descriptions of these alternative futures and then tell us. We had a good sample of about 2,000 representative sample of the population of Australia, to rank those alternative futures and say which ones do you prefer. And we got 72% of the population preferred that community well-being sustainability future. And we also asked them where they thought the country was headed, and they by a large margin said the business as usual free enterprise solution scenario. So there have been some other studies recently that I saw. Here's one that covers several different countries, not just Australia. And they asked the question in a little simpler way. They just said there's two scenarios, business as usual or the sustainability scenario like we're talking about. Tell us, how desirable would it be for you to live in those two scenarios? And you can see that by far, in all of these countries, the sustainability scenario is the preferred option. So, how do we get that message across? How do we build that shared vision in the larger society? Excuse me. Well, I think we need to build a movement. And as was mentioned, I'm an ambassador of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, which is one effort to try to build this larger alliance and a movement. And it's got to be, I think, a movement of movements. We have to get a critical mass, essentially, on board with this vision in order to push the agenda, through the political process to elect the right people that are going to achieve the kind of world that we want. And I think this is the way that that things have changed dramatically in the past. When you create, a significantly shared vision around a new goal, you can change, you can move the needle, you can change the culture. And I'll end with a couple of recent books that you can take a look at that go into a lot more detail on all of these topics, including what is ecological economics, what is well-being, and also this addicted to growth kind of idea. And I'll end with also a plug for a new master's program that we have at UCL. If anybody's interested in really digging into this a little bit further, you can take a look at that. And thank you very much.
So I'm going to ask the speaker to take a seat.
Yep.
And for anyone that has a question, this is the moment where we're going to have a chat.
You lived in the Amazon. Sorry, I don't remember everybody's name, but how long were you actually living out in any communities?
Thank you.
Well, I lived in Brazil for 2 years, and then I lived in Indonesia for 6. But I've been going to and from even when I don't live there since about 2005. So however long that is. It's really loud now. So the longest time that I've stayed in any of the communities, so the pictures that I showed were from the extractive reserve, which is called the Tapajós Arapiuns, and it's in Santarém, near Santarém in the north of Brazil. And there, the longest stretch that I stayed there was 6 months, down the river, which is about 9 hours from town. And that was back in the days also with no, there was no phone. So it was really quite an experience. And I hope sort of laid a good foundation for some of the observations, although not strictly anthropology, because I know an anthropologist would have probably been for years and years. But I'm an ecologist actually by training, and then transitioned into more interdisciplinary science throughout my career. So yes. And then when I lived in Brazil, lived in a small town, but used to go back and forth to communities.
More question?
I suppose following on a little bit about living in the Amazon, I'm thinking about indigenous people, and it doesn't always equate with good biodiversity conservation. But and Bob said something like this has been going on for a long time. I've got a lot to say on that, but not now. But what I want to say now is that back in 1967, when I was still a schoolboy, I read an amazing book called The Elephant People by Dennis Holman. There's not even a copy in the Dennisell library because I just checked. So if anybody wants to donate one so I can read it again, please do. But it was about this amazing tribe in what is now Tanzania, and they hunted elephants, but only small ones and sick ones, and that was a big, huge part of their diet and the culture and everything. And they were basically stopped by colonialization. And the punchline in the book is, these people are now living in extreme poverty on the edges of society, and there's a plague of elephants. So I just wanted to quote that.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. Yeah, I think, there are different patterns that exist in different places around the world. And so I guess, there is, to some degree, the need to generalise, and I suppose some of the arguments that I was making there are generalisations of course there are nuances and context specific, but by and large, wealth is the major driver of decline, and local communities are not, because they're living very low intensity forms of life ways and day-to-day living. So, and your example is an interesting one from that book. And having actually recently last year, I was in Tanzania with a colleague, and there we were talking about trying to sort of understand better people's values that they hold for nature from a well-being, and connecting that to their ideas of well-being and what it means to live well. And actually, I don't have experience working in Tanzania. My colleague does, but having worked with values and well-being, we're collaborating on that. And it was really fascinating because actually, of course, elephants in those contexts are also very, very risky and dangerous, and people hold very different perceptions of the value of elephants than, we might do, for instance. And so I think that there are very context-dependent relationships happening, and so I think that's a fascinating thing also if we're trying to think about a vision, you know, for humanity and the planet and for well-being, because as you go down in scales, there's so many things that vary and change. But yes.
Hi, thank you so much for your talks. They're really interesting. I guess I had a question about the conflicts that may come, particularly, I guess, with local communities who... your point about poverty was really interesting, and how poverty of wealth may not be poverty in life. But I was wondering if you had encountered, or whether you see a conflict that is happening with local communities who have kind of interpolated themselves in the kind of conventional development lens, where they think more wealth is better in terms of livelihood, and how you can then navigate moving into a post-growth lens with these local communities, obviously, you know, with lots of useful knowledge and ways of life. I'm wondering if you had any experience with that or any thoughts about that.
Sure, well, I can talk about, you know, maybe some experience from Brazil, where the older generations worry heavily about the younger generations sort of leaving the communities. And then that, of course, has got huge implications also for conservation, because once territories are not inhabited, then they also won't be defended, and then they're open to conversion. But one of the ways in which perhaps communities can be sort of supported in terms of countering that attrition and the loss is through things such as place-based curricula, because often, you know, education is considered one of the things that's needed, one of the basic services, but throughout the Amazon and many other parts of the world, those curricula are often derived from town-based curricula, and so then don't really apply in a very logical way to the forms of life and lifeways that exist there. So some counter movements on that have been to work towards defining and developing place-based curricula, so giving more value and recognition to the lifeways and the knowledge and the forms of interaction with those landscapes that exist in those communities. And I think that can be one tool. Then I know of, for instance, I've been working with a colleague in Indonesia who is founder of Planet Indonesia, and there they have a program of conservation action where they deliver health services into communities, not conditional on some sort of action change, but just to provide basic health services to communities who don't necessarily have access to those. And through doing that, then also empowering communities to stay in their territories, because that's another reason why people often might leave, to go in search of, you know, healthcare and those sorts of things which are only available through a market economy, so then you need to be working to get them. And there are so many sort of cascading and interlinked actions and events that happen. So I think it would never be just one simple solution, but a multiplicity of different actions across scales, as we were saying before. And there are other examples but maybe I won't go on.
I think before I take another question, because I do want to also bring the other speakers to the discussion, I may ask all of you, and particularly Paul and Bob, a question about something that you raised, Paul, in your presentation. I think it's a really good point, which is we know change is coming. Mm-hmm. We know that we need to change how we're doing things. But the first one that might do it might get penalized. And so in a locked-in system, you might create engagement, we might create a vision, you might get people to think about the future, but the fear of leaving what you know to go into something you don't know, and the penalization that can come with it can be quite a deterrent. Mm-hmm. So if we take all of that into account, and particularly from the two of you, it would be really good to know, and also given that everybody is pushing with different solutions, different voices tapping on the policymakers going, you should do this, you should do this. What is the way to start a conversation about taking the risk to get out of the locked-in situation we're in? So maybe Paul and then Bob?
Yeah, thanks so much. Just to that point about communities and things, I think there's a huge responsibility on the high-income world, because like it or not, the cultures and the practices, the activities, the purchases that we make provide a template for what the good life looks like. Unfortunately, when you look at the actual statistics, it's not that great for a lot of people in high-income countries, but that's what it's projected out into the world. And so our decisions really affect through that, and also the markets. I mean, a lot of the pressures and issues that are experienced are due to markets looking for more areas to exploit, and those are driven by high-income countries and multinationals a lot of the time. On how do we change things and how do you look at this, there's lots of niche exploration of different policies, of different interventions around the world that I think, we can pick up on and amplify. A key example for the food system is the plant-based action plan in Denmark. Pretty much, all the stakeholders across Denmark were like, yeah, we can get on board with this. This sounds good. We know we've got a catastrophe on our hands in terms of the environmental outcomes in the country. We know it's not working for farmers. We know it's not working for consumers. People are getting unhealthy. And so let's get everybody on board and let's move forwards with this action plan where we target all the way across the supply chain in something that we don't know how it's going to, whether it's going to be perfect, but we know we're going to throw stuff at it to try and make it work. So I think learning from those niche examples which can then scale, because each of those different things that change lower the threshold for the next thing that changes. Again, in food systems, what we've been seeing recently is a move to more and more plant-rich diets in the national recommendations. And then that lowers the threshold for governments to say, okay, well, if our nationally recommended diets are doing this, then maybe we should do that for procurement in our sort of public health sector, in our prisons, in our schools, in our, wherever we have. And then that's another domino effect because it supplies a demand for farmers to fill. And so they're then producing healthier, more enriching food. The list goes on and on. So I think, there is, although it seems kind of very difficult to get to that point fast enough, there are many different options that, there are many different people pushing, which lowers these thresholds each time. So it's a question of those cascading effects, which have those dominoes that you can actually push.
But
Yeah, well, like I said, I think there are a lot of solutions out there. I think we know how to achieve the kind of goals that we've been talking about. But I think that what's preventing that is the system that's locked into the growth at all costs economic paradigm, to consumption, to subsidizing fossil fuels, and so until that system can be changed, then all of those policies are going to get to a certain point. But I think and I think they end up being interesting experiments that show the feasibility, of all of the kinds of things we're talking about. But to really get the transformation into the kind of world that we want, we've got to overcome that addiction to the current system. And like I'm saying, the missing element there is that we don't have this shared vision that's driving that transformation. We're still locked into the, consuming more and more. That's what's going to lead to your happiness. You have to keep up with the Joneses. That's what's being sold, I think, to the general population every day through the media, through advertising, through everything that comes out. The labor government, even the labor government is saying, what we got to do is grow. That's the solution to all of our problems. So in that context, it's hard for the kinds of policies that we're talking about to make any progress. So I think we need to recognize that simply pointing out that yes, we can do better. Here are policies that work. That's fine, but that's not going to overcome the addiction by itself. We've got to think of it in a more nuanced, in a more, I guess, sophisticated, a more therapeutic way. What's it going to take to get over this? How do you do battle with the special interests like the fossil fuel sector? And until that happens, I think then we're going to not make the progress that we need to make.
I'm going to go back to, I know you have a lot of questions. I'm going to start here because I know you've been waiting.
And I should say that I think that vision is already shared among the vast majority of people, but it's not being acted on. There's a really interesting study in the U.S. where they looked at 1,700 different policies. They said how much of those policies were influenced by public opinion, in the direction, and how much was it influenced by special interests. And the conclusion was 0% was influenced by public opinion. It was all influenced by special interests. So the people, I think, in general, in the US, in the UK, globally, are behind the kind of vision we're talking about. It just has not been articulated. It hasn't been, sort of packaged in a way that can have the influence and get it back to the people themselves. That we're not alone. We're probably in the vast majority. But how do you make that more apparent to the system? Yeah.
Yeah, and you're coming towards my question, which was, I appreciate the addiction metaphor very much, and I'm glad you talked about supply chains, because actually the problem with addiction is often not the addicts or even the producers, which might be in a rainforest themselves, it's the dealers. Can we talk about the dealers, the people who really profit, and how we can lead them to, see their own enlightened self-interest in stop screwing the planet? It's the corporations and sometimes nation states as well, but it's the dealers who are really profiting. Yeah. Consumers might get their one-off hit from a flight to visit Antarctica or whatever, but it's sorry, I should stop rambling because I think you get what I'm saying, and you were working your way towards that point anyway, I think.
Yes, and I think, like the fossil fuel sector, I mean, they're subsidized tremendously. They produce, the ExxonMobil is the world's largest producer of misinformation in the world. They lobby, governments. They basically have purchased, I think, several governments around the world. So that's sort of part of the addiction metaphor, that they have got the system locked in for their own special interests, not for the larger interests. And they've certainly known about the impacts of fossil fuel burning on climate, since way back, since the beginning. So it's like the tobacco industry and trying to hide the impacts of what they were doing. But eventually it becomes known, and eventually if we could get a large enough fraction of the population really to get on board, that's what we need. We need the movement.
And not just feel guilty.
Join the movement, or movement of movements.
Rachel, do you want to come in on the dealers from a global perspective?
I think that's exactly right, and I think that's also a little bit the tragedy, really, because on one hand, what I feel and think is that it's the citizens that need to mobilise to demand for these changes, because the fat cats who are winning are not going to create these changes there without being demanded of them. But then, if we're all addicted and not making those demands, then how is it going to happen? I think it's really it's a big problem. Maybe someone else has.
No, I was just going to add. No, it's a very good point. Under the current system, though, that we have, I mean, how you break down these vested interests is the rise of other vested interests, and actually, at the moment, those vested interests are broadly more beneficial if you look at renewable energy. And so if you have a look at sort of the fossil fuel system and then you look at the renewables, what's taken a very long time is for the renewable industries to realize they have to be lobbyists too in this system. And then by degrading that power, then you basically then diffusing that power, and then the renewables and the renewable energies are more distributed versions. So I think this is what I'm getting at in this point of like this pathway of sustainable transitions do have the potential for being more democratizing and for being more distributed and being more community driven. I mean, if you look at the way Germany did their renewable energy transition so far, it's very much community owned. It's very much insulated then from some of those communities, not all of Germany, but insulated from some of these issues in energy supply. And you can look at that same picture in the food system. Now, there's always going to be that potential for concentration of power in those niche sectors that are then building up and then sort of expanding as they become major. But some of these technologies are fundamentally more distributed than others. So I think there's a possibility for a chink in the armor there that, can be levered open.
I'm going to take the question here.
Thank you so much for the talk. Super interesting. Paul, I had a question for you regarding your research on the mining and the energy transition decoupling.
Yeah.
Super interesting research there. And I just wondered, what role does circular economy transition play in that scenario? And also, what was that kind of quarter proportion of other tech and infra? Because it seemed to make up quite a large proportion to cancel out the coal and fossil fuel. And just wondered, like, what is it?
Yeah, thanks so much. So in that, we sort of, what we modelled was an increase in the recycling rates to the best in class today in the best materials. And so moving up to 90% recovery and then recycling rates. I think the thing with these names and these sort of circular economy, sustainable development, they can be used in so many different ways, and we have to be a little bit sort of critical of them, because are they then just replacing the need for any of these specific policies to come in? So people can just say, oh, well, this is going to be circular. We can map everything to circular economy, so everything we're doing is circular. So I always get a little bit worried about sort of how that's used. The same thing in regenerative farming right now. This idea that everything could go under it. And so if we, as a business or whatever, we can say we're doing regenerative things, and then suddenly the whole problem goes away. It doesn't, because the fundamental transitions, but we know what they need to be, and they are confronting our demand and confronting what we do. Just that point about the energy transition in general, once those materials are in society, they're held in society. I don't know, like, it's hard to overstate how revolutionary that is. Instead of having gigatons, billions of tons of material mined every year, and then burning it, and then just putting it up into the smokestacks and just dissipating it and not having anything to show for it. We're moving to stocks of materials in society, which will be smaller than we currently are doing every single year, and then we keep it in society. Like the sort of geopolitical consequences of that are vast. So I think it's going to be quite. Whether we get to this future or not, I don't know, because I think all of those disruptive forces that I mentioned, all of them are acting in concert, all of them are acting together, and the odds are against us. But, if we can get through it, then it is quite remarkable.
Was the policy scenario integrated into that, just out of interest? Or
so the policy scenario we took there was a 1.5 degree, which, we basically, passed at this stage. But that was an extreme scenario with a massive rollout of materials. So that's the International Energy Agency's assumptions on just materials for everybody, as I say. So way more electric vehicles than I would like to see personally, as an individual. But so everything that we'll see will be below that line that you saw.
Thank you so much for the talk. So my question is for Ms. Rachel again. So I actually did my master's dissertation based in the Amazon, but it was on the Peruvian side.
Okay.
So while researching, I got to know about that the community hunting, like that the government doesn't really recognize indigenous hunting in Brazil. Like, so what does exactly the Brazilian government in general looks at indigenous hunting as far as like their hunting laws are concerned? Because in Peruvian side, it's pretty much like they work in collaboration, but in Brazil, through my literature review, when I read, I didn't see the same scenarios. So I would like to know your input on that.
Well, in the extractive reserves, which is a model of conservation unit in which traditional communities are permitted to live and they are allowed to hunt and to gather resources from the forest, but they're not allowed to sell. So there's a stipulation where hunting is for subsistence use only. And even then, it's something which can be sort of difficult for people to talk about openly if they feel as though you're maybe part of a conservation organisation, for instance, or even related to the reserve management under the Environment Agency that manages those reserves, because although there is permitted subsistence hunting, there are still different rules that may vary between reserves depending on the managers. And so, there are certain species which are forbidden also to be hunted. And so you really need to have been there for a while and for people to trust you, and then to also be careful about how you publish and anonymise your data and things like that, because whilst there are permissions, it's also not exactly black and white.
I'm going to go to the lady in front of you with the blue. Yes.
Hello, good evening. I'm going to ask a slightly loaded question.
If we can just mix it one, because I'm trying to...
Yeah, no, be quick. Robert, you discussed a shared vision, which I think is a bit complicated in an ever polarizing world, right? We're talking about large income inequalities and very complex challenges. And Paul, you discussed, the complexities around pension schemes and how we address national debt with this transition, right? Is democracy a suitable model to address these things?
Yes, I think democracy is a great idea, and we ought to try it.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the problem. We don't really have true democracies. In maybe Scandinavia's, like the closest thing that we have, but certainly the U.S., has been called a flawed democracy. And I think that process, we're not really getting public opinion and the public to deliberate. And so I think the idea of deliberative democracy is really a good way of thinking about it. How do we get citizen assemblies, citizen juries, to come together, and they would lack the influence that representative democracy has. You randomly select people to be part of a citizen assembly and allow them to have input from whatever experts are needed. Those kinds of processes actually lead to very good decisions because you get the full range of opinion in the population. You're really representing what the people think.
Is that assuming that you have a very educated population without vested interest then?
Yes, exactly. So that's one way. And certainly, there are ways we can improve the democratic systems that we have, basically getting the money out of the process, because now the vested interests basically own the process. They run the process. It's an oligarchy or whatever you want to call it, but it's certainly not a democracy. Or anything even approximating one. And I think that's really what we need going forward. And I think it also relates to people's sense of well-being. So if you want a well-being future and a well-being economy, participation in decision-making is a major component that most people want and need, to feel a sense of well-being. And that I think is necessary at many different levels, in the workplace, in the community, in the nation, in the world. And I think, we do have the communication technology these days to actually do something interesting like that. I don't think we've really been thinking of it in that direction. It's been used for the opposite purposes of keeping people apart rather than building shared visions and doing sort of massive deliberative processes to figure out what it is that we really want.
Paul?
Yeah. Just to add very, very briefly, if you look at the UK Citizens' Assembly, they were talking about banning SUVs, frequent flyer levies, reductions in meat. This is far beyond where the politics is at. And when you look at the percentage of support on some of these interventions, the ones that seem more equal get even more support. So one of the highest supported interventions that around the country is frequent flyer levies, because that seems seen as unfair to be taking so many flights. Anyway, what the research shows time and time again is we underestimate how much other people care about the issues, and we usually underestimate by about half. So the support is actually double what we think it is in society.
And how much consensus there really is on most of the progressive policies that we're talking about. I think that there's usually much higher support than the system would care to recognize.
Thank you. I don't see sustainability and growth as being binary. And I'd welcome your thoughts on how do you develop, I take a lot of what you say, how do you develop step change pragmatic policies that link into political reality? So, for example, if you take the UK and the demands of a growing and an older population, a crumbling health service, the need for housing, defence in a troubled world, how do you achieve some of the steps you want to while still maintaining the necessary growth that's required in order to provide these services for the population, bearing in mind that in a democracy, which we do have, we have elections every 5 years and politicians are accountable to the population?
Well, you have elections every 5 years, but who are those politicians really accountable to? Are the, is it really the population, or is it the other interests that support those candidates? And I think that's what some of the studies that I mentioned, or at least one of the studies in the U.S. showed, that those politicians are not making decisions and implementing policies that the population actually wants. They're implementing policies that the special interests want. So is that a democracy? I would argue it's barely one. At least it's a special interest democracy, but it's not a overall democracy. How do you make the transition? I think there are strategies that could do that. You could tax the rich, for example, use those funds. You could have, you could recognize that growth is not necessary to achieve sustainable well-being. Now, a level of activity is certainly necessary. You have a stabilizing population, so you don't really need to have more and more for everybody, but you need to redistribute what's already there. We were, income inequality was declining quite rapidly after World War II until Margaret Thatcher showed up in 1980 and started things going in the opposite direction. So it is possible to reduce inequality. It is possible to solve all of these problems. I would point you to Peter Victor's work. He has a book called Managing Without Growth, or Tim Jackson has a book called Prosperity Without Growth. But in Peter Victor's case, he did a computer simulation model of the Canadian economy and asked that very question. Can you have a modern economy where GDP is not growing? And again, it's GDP, it's material consumption that we're really talking about. I mean, what you want to grow, what you want to improve is well-being. And so it's not like you don't want anything to change. You want to make society better, but not necessarily bigger. And I think it's the bigger part that's getting in the way. Anyway, Peter Victor's model showed that yes, you could have a disaster if you just shut off GDP growth and didn't do anything else. But you could have also a sort of low or no grow economy that supplied reduced inequality, better dealing with climate, all of the things that we're talking about, with the appropriate set of policy interventions that had to do with changing work hours. There's a whole list of things that could be done and have been done in other places quite effectively. So it's not inconceivable. I think the pie in the sky sort of fantasy is that we continue doing what we're doing. I think what we really need to do is make the transition and make it as quickly as possible.
We are approaching nearby the end, so I'm going to take one last question from the gentleman here. Yes.
Yeah, you.
That's great. Thanks for some interesting talks. And I'm glad you mentioned well-being, because I get my feeling of well-being when I get in my Mercedes and I cruise up the motorway. That's what gives me my well-being. About consumerism, I'm wondering if, like you talk about growth and you mentioned consumerism, is that the whole concept of like this addiction to growth is the sort of pot boiling away, and it's consumerism that's the fire underneath that pot. And I'm wondering if we'll get anywhere without addressing consumerism per se. And when you showed your models, I might have missed it. There was a lot of stuff going on, but I didn't see sort of consumerism featured highly in there. Is there anything you might want to add about that?
Well, I mentioned this this work in positive psychology, as it's called, that addresses that question. That what do we really need the level of consumption? Is that really what makes people happy? And there's a good book by Tim Kasser, actually, called The High Price of Materialism, where he looked at the difference in mental and physical health among people who are highly motivated by material consumption versus those who are, highly motivated by other things. And the more highly materially oriented you are, the worse your mental and physical health tend to be. So it's not something that actually is needed as much. We need a level of material consumption, but I think it also needs. I like the Swedish term lagom, if you know that one, which means just enough. Everybody should have not too much, not too little. The sort of Goldilocks effect. So it's overconsumption. It's sort of making that what your whole life is about. Is to keep up with the Joneses, as opposed to, you have enough of that material consumption, and that allows time to focus on other things, which we know from the positive psychology literature really do contribute to your sense of well-being. Participating in community, your family, your being out in nature, all of the other things that contribute to life satisfaction. That would get in the way if you're too focused on materialism.
Yeah, that's very true. I just want to say what that other lady said about education, because the trouble is that we get stuff forced upon us, and the pressure is so great. And I think what she said about education, I thought your reply on democracy, yes, it'd be nice to have it, I thought was really appropriate. Thanks very much.
I'm going to bring in Paul and Rachel, though, in case there's any last thoughts, any on either the last few questions or this.
Well, I would say, on the last point about consumerism, I think that as individuals, we might not necessarily have this insatiable appetite to consume. We're almost pawns, aren't we, and at the whim of the policies that are steering us and the narratives that are being told, the story and the film that we're being sort of having pushed upon us, and breaking those habits probably wouldn't be so difficult if only the pathways to doing so were provided for us. And there's a great example of that in the UK on recycling, where now more or less everybody recycles regardless of whether or not they're environmentally minded. But because the system has created the structures that we would be stupid not to recycle, so therefore everyone's doing it. And I think that, with the whole sort of obsession with consumerism, that's also being put upon us. And if only it wasn't, then we would be alleviated of that. And, planned obsolescence and those different things that maybe would be fixed in, circular economy, for instance, if planned obsolescence wasn't pushed upon us, then we would be able to buy one thing and share it. And if we lived in collectives, we could have one thing and share it down our road. And there are lots of different initiatives. I think COVID sort of gave birth to many sharing initiatives and different initiatives around the UK springing up to allow us to kind of access those other ways of being, but they're still very alternative, and I think it's quite risky to inhabit those spaces because you have to forfeit a lot, including in some spaces your legitimacy. If you go and live off grid, it's quite a big statement, and so I think a lot of change needs to happen in terms of making better options possible for us, which would include consuming less. And to demystify these alternatives and to celebrate actually well-being over consumption. But there are so many cogs that need to be in operation to make that change manifest. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, we're facing some of the most powerful, structured, organised, strong, rich industries that we've ever seen. And so, of course, in that onslaught, it's difficult to assert some of the things that we've been talking about in terms of well-being and how we actually feel about things. We're constantly, and I think that's, we struggle a little bit with the science on that as well, because we're constantly bombarded with a very well-organised rearguard action against any change. Well, it's not even rearguard, it's in front of us, right? But I think that, the more we see the things going wrong, like look at the food system right now, I could bring this back to the food system. Everybody across, government policy, seems to be well understood that this is not working for us. The food environment that people have is not about their specific choice, their individual choice. It's about the choices that they have are predetermined by a certain set of incentives and industry interests. And we still struggle to get advertising off the TV for children for unhealthy foods. You know, but I do think something's breaking there. I think that there is now an effort and a move towards breaking that power and that cycle of consuming unhealthy food for us. But
thank you so much. Well, help me first thank the speakers today, because that's great. But also thanks to all of you for coming, for asking questions, and for making this evening a really enjoyable event, at least to me. And thank you again very much, and have a lovely evening.